At a forward air base close to Krimskaya in southern Russia, Captain Alexander Purishkin entered the cockpit of his P-39 Airacocobra at 10:15 a.m. on April 9, 1943, in anticipation of his first combat win in a plane that would turn the world upside down. The American-built fighter was sent across two oceans, rejected by American squadrons, hated by British pilots, and dismissed as useless by almost every Western Air Force that attempted to fly it. Priskin's commanding commander had informed him 24 hours prior that the new fighters would be arriving shortly, owing to lease shipments from the United States. After testing them, the British declined to retain them. After a brief deployment in the Pacific, the Americans were already switching to more advanced aircraft. Soviet pilots were supposed to fly these hand-me-downs against the Luftwaffe once they were transported to Russia. Pokin has 2 years of experience flying the MiG-3 and Yak-1. Both were good Soviet designs. Both had issues, but they were both capable of fighting German messes and competing in battle. Engines that broke down at the worst possible times, firearms that jammed, and radios that hardly functioned. There was a notoriety for the new American fighter, the P-39, before it even existed. Pilots in Britain referred to it as a death trap. It was unable to climb, turn with a zero, or intercept bombers over 15,000 feet, according to American pilots in New Guinea. In the Pacific, an American joke said that the export model, the P-400, was simply a P-39 with a zero on the tail. One major fault in the aircraft's design ended its chances of being used by the Western Air Forces. The prototype had a turbocharger installed during development in 1938, enabling superior performance at high altitude. On April 6, 1938, the XP-39 made its inaugural flight, reaching 20,000 feet at 390 miles per hour in just 5 minutes. However, in order to boost speed and decrease drag, the Army Air Corps ordered the prototype to Narco wind tunnels in June 1939. The installation of the turbocharger caused considerable drag, according to engineers. Bell Aircraft suggested doing away with the turbocharger completely in August 1939 and substituting a straightforward single-stage, single-speed supercharger. The P-39's capacity to operate at high altitude was damaged by that choice. The engine choked for air above 15,000 feet. Performance plummeted. The fighter was at 20,000 feet and powerless. This was unsatisfactory to the American and British Air Forces, who planned to accompany bombers at 25,000 feet or higher. The P-400 was tested by RAF pilots in late 1941, but they rejected it right away. They claimed that at significant combat altitudes, the aircraft was not as good as the Spitfire and Hurricane. Even worse, it had a risky propensity to suddenly go into flat spins. The engine sat behind the pilot, causing the center of gravity to be too far back. The aircraft became tail-heavy after the 37mm nose gun discharged and expended its ammunition. On test flights, a number of British pilots came dangerously close to death when their Airacocobras went into spins from which they could hardly escape. The same was true for the Americans. P-39s and P-400s went into action in early 1942 to stop the Japanese invasion of the Pacific. They were flown by squadrons in Port Moresby, Guadalcanal, and all around New Guinea. Pilots quickly learned what the British had already figured out. Japanese bombers flying at 20,000 feet were too high for the P-39 to intercept. It was unable to climb quickly enough to get to them. When it finally got airborne, it was too weak to fight. Above 15,000 feet, American pilots said the plane seemed squishy, like they were flying through mud. Responses from the control group were slow. The speed decreased. At altitude, Japanese Zeros could circle them. In New Guinea, Lieutenant Evan Stevens flew P-39s with the 39th Fighter Squadron. Later, he explained the frustration. The aircraft's sleek form and nose-mounted cannon made it look impressive, but it was unable to meet the demands of Pacific combat. Stevens's flight rushed to stop a Japanese raid during one battle over Leh in April 1942. They pushed the Allison engines to their limit as they ascended quickly. They could see the German bombers 5,000 feet above them by the time they reached 15,000 feet. The P-39 found it difficult to increase its altitude. They were climbing at an almost zero rate. When the Zeros spotted them approaching, they jumped down to fight. At 18,000 feet, Stevens' wingman was trapped in a turning battle. The P-39 sluggishly navigated the curve. The Zero got weapons on him and reversed. Stevens saw the smoke trailing from his wingman's plane as it crashed. Altitude performance was not the only issue. On paper, it seemed like deadly firepower from the 37mm M4 cannon installed in the nose and shooting through the propeller hub. In actual use, it jammed all the time. Because of the heavy shell's arcing trajectory and the cannon's poor rate of fire, only 3 rounds per second, targeting moving targets was practically difficult. Pilots stated that just the machine guns were available after the cannon jammed after firing 2 or 3 rounds. Because maintenance technicians couldn't maintain the nose cannons operating in the jungle circumstances, P-39s took off on some missions with them utterly non-functional. The 30 caliber machine guns mounted on the wings were too light to do much harm to Japanese aircraft. The only weaponry with actual stopping power were the 2 50 caliber rifles in the nose. However, 2 guns were insufficient. American pilots in the Pacific began referring to the P-39 as the Iron Dog by the end of 1942. They asked to be transferred as quickly as possible to P-38 squadrons. By December, the 5th Air Force reported that it had destroyed roughly 80 Japanese aircraft, but it had also lost a comparable number of P-39s. At best, the kill ratio was 1-to-1. That was insufficient for an Air Force that had to attain air superiority over seasoned Japanese pilots. Second Lieutenant William Fiedler was the only American pilot to achieve ace status while piloting the P-39. Fiedler shot down 5 Japanese planes over the Russell Islands and Guadalcanal between January and June 1943. On June 12th, he defeated Cape Esperance by a distance of 100 miles, marking his 3rd triumph. 4 days later, Fiedler became the sole P-39 ace in American service when he shot down 2 Val dive bombers, while 380 escorted 50 Vals toward American transports off the Guadalcanal. 2 weeks later, on June 30th, 1943, Fiedler was killed on the ground when a P-38 Lightning slammed into his parked P-39 as he was sitting in the cockpit due to an engine failure after takeoff. Both planes went off. Fiedler passed very soon after being dragged unconscious from the flaming wreckage. He was never able to appreciate his special position in the history of American aviation. His passing appeared to encapsulate the P-39's standing among U.S. military personnel. Even the only ace in the plane perished as a result of it, not from the enemy, but from an accident that would not have occurred had he been piloting a different fighter. As replacement aircraft became available, the Army Air Force began to phase out P-39s by the middle of 1943. Frontline tasks were being taken over by P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s. The rest of the P-39s were assigned to secondary theaters or training groups. In every way the Americans relied on the fighter, it had fallen short. The narrative ought to have stopped here. A crucial engineering choice destroyed a promising idea. Relegated to history as a warning about cutting necessary parts to save weight, it was rejected by the powers that ordered it. In Russia, however, something else took place. There was no high-altitude combat during the Eastern Front air conflict. Soviet pilots had low hopes of the first P-4Os that came to Murman in late 1941 via Arctic convoy. According to what they had heard, the planes were hand-me-downs that the British didn't want. The spin characteristics warnings were validated by the initial test flights. Soviet test pilots made a conscious effort to replicate the flat spin issue and were successful right away. If the aircraft was flown with an empty nose ammunition bay, it would suddenly go into a severe flat spin with little to no notice. American onlookers were taken aback by the display and were unable to replicate the spin back home. During those test flights, however, Soviet pilots discovered something else. The performance of the P-39 was excellent below 15,000 feet. At low and medium altitudes, the Allison engine generated a lot of power. Below 12,000 feet, the aircraft outperformed the majority of Soviet fighters. It had good sight from the bubble canopy, turned firmly and rolled crisply. Above all, it possessed something that Soviet combatants sorely lacked: a trustworthy radio. The P-39's SCR-522 radio system operated reliably and with clarity and power. Soviet pilots were able to coordinate attacks, warn of threats, communicate with one another while in flight, and keep formation discipline. For the VVS, where the majority of fighters either lacked radios or had radios that hardly functioned, this was revolutionary. Pilots could coordinate tactics, communicate in real time about enemy positions and tactical circumstances, hear each other plainly as if they were speaking on a telephone next to each other, and never be caught off guard again. There was a lot of firepower. Although temperamental to Americans, the 37mm cannon was more effective for Soviet maintenance teams who placed a higher priority on keeping weapons in working order. A single strike from the large round fired by the M4 cannon may destroy opposing aircraft. Soviet pilots changed their strategies in response to the slow rate of fire, which was just 3 rounds per second, which frustrated American pilots attempting to hit moving targets. To increase the likelihood of a strike, they learned to fire at closer ranges. They discovered the exact lead angles required for the trajectory of the cannon. They rehearsed until the peculiarities of the weapon became predictable and controllable. They synchronized the firing of the two 50-caliber machine guns located on the nose through the propeller. These weapons were easier to aim and had a higher rate of fire than the cannon. Soviet pilots frequently walked fire onto targets with machine guns before completing the shot with a cannon if their aim was accurate. This gave the P-39 the strongest forward-firing weaponry of any Soviet fighter when paired with the gun. Although domestic Soviet fighters usually carried 1 or 2 cannon in addition to machine guns, the P-39's combination of heavy machine guns and big-caliber cannon proved particularly lethal. To reduce weight and increase roll rate, Soviet pilots started removing the 30-caliber machine guns mounted on the wings right away. Including ammunition, these outboard weapons contributed about 60 pounds. Eliminating them improved stability by pushing the aircraft's center of gravity forward a little. More significantly, lower wing weight allowed for higher roll rates by lowering rotational inertia. The removal of the wing cannons made the aircraft lighter, easier to maneuver, and easier to maintain. The modification worked perfectly. Soviet pilot Nikolai Golodnikov later recalled, "We immediately removed the wing machine guns, leaving 1 cannon and 2 machine guns. That modification improved roll rate by reducing rotational inertia. The cockpit was very comfortable, and visibility was outstanding. The instrument panel was very ergonomic, with the entire complement of instruments right up to an artificial horizon and radio compass." Soviet mechanics also modified other systems based on pilot feedback. Some units adjusted control cable tensions to improve responsiveness. Others modified the oxygen system for better high-altitude performance, though this was less critical given the typical combat altitudes. The fuel system received attention to improve cold weather, starting essential for operations in Russian winters. These field modifications, while minor individually, collectively improved the aircraft's suitability for Eastern Front conditions. The contrast with American maintenance practices was stark. American mechanics worked under strict technical order compliance. Modifications required engineering approval through official channels. Field expedient solutions were discouraged or forbidden. This rigidity made sense for aircraft operating from established bases with full supply chains, but it prevented the kind of adaptive optimization that Soviet units achieved in field conditions. Soviet mechanics had more autonomy to make changes based on operational experience. Their modifications weren't always documented or officially approved, but they worked. And most critically, the tactical environment on the Eastern Front played to every one of the P-39's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. German and Soviet air combat in 1943 happened predominantly between 5,000 and 15,000 feet. Ground attack aircraft operated at low level. Fighters providing cover flew at medium altitudes. The massive tank battles and artillery duels that characterized Eastern Front warfare meant aircraft spent most of their time supporting ground operations at altitudes where the P-39 excelled. Unlike the Pacific or Europe, where bombers attacked from 20,000 feet or higher, German bombers on the Eastern Front typically operated below 15,000 feet when attacking Soviet positions. Stuka's dive bombers came down low. J-88 level bombers rarely flew above 12,000 feet over the battlefield. Fighters escorting them stayed at similar altitudes. This meant Soviet P-39 pilots could fight at the exact altitude band where their aircraft performed best. Between 8,000 and 15,000 feet, the P-39 could outrun early Messid B F-109 models, match the later ones, and hold its own against everything except the newest FW-190S. The sturdy construction meant it could take battle damage and keep flying. The armor protection around the pilot was thick and effective. Soviet pilots quickly fell in love with the aircraft they nicknamed Kobushka. Dear Little Cobra or Cobra Stoska, a blend of cobra and lastoska, meaning swallow. The affection was genuine. Getting these aircraft to the Soviet Union was itself an epic journey. P-39S destined for Russia began at Bell Aircraft's factory in Wheatfield, New York. From there, they flew to Great Falls, Montana. Female pilots from the Women Air Force Service pilots, the WASPs, often flew this leg, fingers across the American continent. At Great Falls, male American pilots took over, flying the fighters northwest to Fairbanks or Nome, Alaska. This was already a challenging route, crossing thousands of miles of wilderness. But the truly dangerous part came next. At Alaskan airfields, American pilots turned the aircraft over to Soviet pilots who would fly them across the Bering Sea to Siberia. This Alaska-Siberia route called Aleb was one of the most unusual and dangerous supply lines of the war. Soviet pilots flew single-seat fighters in groups accompanied by twin-engine bombers or transports that provided navigation and safety watch. They crossed vast stretches of open ocean where a single engine failure meant death in freezing water. Weather was brutal. Storms could appear without warning. Navigation was difficult with few landmarks over water and ice. Many pilots were lost on this route, disappearing into the Arctic without a trace. Those who made it landed at airfields in eastern Siberia, where the aircraft were inspected, serviced, and prepared for the next leg. From there, P-39s flew west across Siberia torn, then on to staging areas near the front lines. The journey from New York to a Soviet fighter regiment could take weeks and covered over 7,000 meters. Every 39 pesos that reached Soviet squadrons had already survived an incredible journey. Alexander Purushkin became the champion of the P-39 in Soviet service. By early 1943, he had already scored nearly 20 victories flying MiG-3s and Yak-1s. He was aggressive, analytical, and constantly studying tactics to gain advantages over German pilots. When his regiment, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, converted to P-39s in January 1943, Purushkin threw himself into mastering the new aircraft. He spent weeks training in the rear, studying the fighter's characteristics, learning its strengths and limitations. He developed new tactics specifically designed around the P-39's capabilities. One innovation was the bookshelf formation. Purushkin arranged his fighters in stacked layers at different altitudes, each layer covering the one below, each with specific tasks. If an enemy tried to escape the first layer, the second layer intercepted. If the second layer engaged, the third provided cover. The formation required precise coordination and communication. Only the P-39's excellent radio made it possible. Pushkin also pioneered the use of ground-based radar coordination. The 4th Air Army received its first mobile radar stations in the summer of 1942. Purushkin worked with radar controllers to develop intercept procedures using radio to guide fighters toward German formations before visual contact. The system worked brilliantly, allowing Soviet fighters to ambush German aircraft with perfect positioning. On April 9, 1943, Purushkin flew his first combat mission in a P-39. 8 Arakko Cobras intercepted a German formation over Krimskaya. Messerschmitt 109s attacking Soviet Lag 3S. Purushkin rolled in from altitude, selected a Bf-109, and opened fire with all weapons. The 37mm cannon shells walked up the fuselage. The Messerschmitt's engine exploded. Pieces flew off. The fighter rolled inverted and fell, trailing black smoke. First kill in the P-39. 3 days later, on April 12th, Purushkin shot down 4 Messerschmitt 109s in a single engagement over Iran. He used the bookshelf formation, coordinating attacks with his flight, using the P-39's radio to direct each pilot into position. The German fighters tried to reverse and counter, but the Soviet formation adapted instantly. Purushkin's flight maintained altitude advantage, dictated engagement terms, and shot down 4 enemy aircraft without loss. Between April 9th and April 30th, 1943, Purushkin claimed 12 victories flying the P-39. Other pilots in his regiment were achieving similar success. The tactics were spreading. The results were undeniable. On April 29, 1943, one of the most famous engagements occurred. 8 P-39 era Cobras one piloted by Pakushkin, were directed by ground control toward a large German formation. Three full squadrons of Junkers J-87 Stuka dive bombers were being escorted by a Gashueta of Bf-109s, the Soviets attacked from the Sunday. A pair of P-39s engaged the fighters while the remaining six dove through the bomber formation, repeating the attack multiple times. The engagement lasted minutes, but the results were devastating for the Germans. 12 German aircraft were shot down. Pokin claimed 5 kills himself. Not a single Soviet aircraft was lost. This was the kind of success Soviet pilots had rarely achieved earlier in the war. On May 24, 1943, Purushkin received his first Hero of the Soviet Union award. By June, he was promoted to major and given command of a squadron. He exchanged his P-39K-1 model for a new P-39N, aircraft number 100, marked with white numerals. He would fly this aircraft for the rest of the war. The Germans noticed something had changed. Luftwaffe pilots on the Eastern Front began reporting in mid-1943 that Soviet fighters were performing differently, more aggressive, better coordinated, harder to surprise. Intelligence reports mentioned American-built fighters with heavy-nose airmen, fast at low altitude and always operating in coordinated groups with calm, excellent radio discipline. Grigory Arkalov, flying as Purushkin's wingman in the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, became another P-39 expert. Arkalov had an unusual backstory. He suffered from color blindness, which should have disqualified him from flying. He hid his condition throughout training and the early war. On July 26, 1941, during a combat sortie, Rachov's Rafale 16 was hit by anti-aircraft fire. He was wounded in the right leg but managed to land his damaged aircraft. Surgeons saved the leg, but Rechkov spent months recovering. He returned to duty in April 1942 and continued flying despite his color vision deficiency. Rechkov had started the war flying a 16 and I-153 achieving modest success. When the regiment converted to P-39s, Rekolov found his stride. The aircraft matched his aggressive flying style perfectly. By the end of 1942, Rechkov had 4 solo victories and 2 shared. By May 1943, after 2 months flying the P-39 in combat over the Kuban, he had 12 solo victories and 2 shared. The aircraft transformed his effectiveness as a fighter pilot. On May 24, 1943, the same day Purushkin received his first Hero of the Soviet Union award, Rekolov received his as well. Both men flew P-39s. Both would score the majority of their wartime victories in American-built fighters. Rechkov eventually scored 44 of his 56 victories flying P-39s. Most of these victories came in 2 specific aircraft that he flew for extended periods. P-39 serial number 42-8747 and P-39 Q-15 serial number 44-2547. He marked both aircraft with his initials RGA on the tail. Soviet mechanics maintained them meticulously. Arkalov developed a personal connection with these aircraft, knew their quirks, trusted their reliability, and pushed them to their limits in combat. He survived being shot down, wounded multiple times, and involved in one catastrophic engagement on May 31, 1944, where 5 P-39s were lost after he pursued enemy fighters alone rather than maintaining formation discipline. Yet he kept flying the Airacobra, kept scoring victories, and kept proving that the aircraft Americans had rejected could dominate in the right hands and the right tactical environment. By June 1943, several other Soviet pilots were achieving remarkable success with P-39s. Nikolai Gulev scored 32 of his 57 victories in Arobas. Gulev was known for his aggressive tactics and exceptional marksmanship. He preferred to close to very short range before firing, maximizing the effectiveness of the P-39's concentrated firepower. His approach was risky but devastatingly effective. Gulev received the Hero of the Soviet Union award twice and survived the war despite being shot down multiple times. Dmitry Glinker scored 50 victories with the vast majority in P-39s. Glinker flew in the 100th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment and was known for his methodical approach to combat. Unlike some aces who relied on instinct and aggression, Glinker studied his opponents carefully, looking for patterns and weaknesses. He kept detailed notes on German tactics and shared his observations with other pilots. His analytical approach complemented Poriskin's tactical innovations perfectly. Glinker was eventually seriously wounded on July 15, 1944, when he bailed out of his badly damaged Airacobra and struck its tailplane during ejection. He survived but required months of recovery. Alexander Clubb scored 31 of his 50 victories in American fighters. Clubb was one of the pilots who participated in the May 31, 1944 engagement, where Rikolov's formation lost 5 aircraft. Despite that disaster, Clubb continued flying P-39s and achieved consistent success throughout 1944. His experience demonstrated that even in difficult engagements against newer German fighters, skilled pilots in P-39s could survive and prevail. Another notable P-39 pilot was Ivan Babak, who scored 33 victories, most in Cobras. Babak was known for his exceptional eyesight and ability to spot enemy aircraft before his wingmen. This skill, combined with the P-39's radio, made him an invaluable early warning asset for his formation. Babak would spot German fighters at extreme range, report their position via radio, and guide his formation into optimal attack positions. His contributions went far beyond his personal kill count. The pattern was clear. Half of the Soviet Union's top 10 aces scored the majority of their victories flying P-39s. This wasn't a small sample size or statistical anomaly. It represented a fundamental reality about the aircraft's effectiveness in Soviet service. This wasn't coincidence. This was the systematic result of matching aircraft capabilities to mission requirements. The Soviets received 4,719 P-39s through Lend-Lease, accounting for more than 1/3 of all American and British supplied fighters in Soviet service. Nearly half of all P-39 production went to Russia. These aircraft were flown hard, maintained under difficult conditions, and used in constant combat. Soviet-era Cobra losses totaled 1,030 aircraft between 1942 and 1945. 49 lost in 1942, 305 in 1943, 486 in 1944, 190 in 1945. The loss rate increased as the war intensified, and Soviet forces pushed westward, facing more concentrated Luftwaffe resistance and newer German fighters like the FW-190 and late model Bf-109S. But the victories increased even faster. By mid-1943, the kill ratio for Soviet P-39 units was positive. They were destroying more German aircraft than they lost. This reversed the typical exchange rate early in the war, when Soviet fighters often traded 1-for-1 or worse with the Luftwaffe. German pilots began to recognize and fear certain Soviet formations. When Purushkin's unit was transferred to operations in Ukraine, Luftwaffe radio operators would warn their pilots when he was in the air. Pokin used the radio call Seinka, meaning 100, the number painted on his aircraft. German pilots learned that hearing Sotka meant Poriskin was airborne. Some Luftwaffe units were ordered to stay on the ground when radio intelligence confirmed he was flying. This was unprecedented. A single Soviet pilot in an American fighter that had been rejected by Western air forces was causing the Luftwaffe to avoid combat. German after-action reports from the Eastern Front between mid-1943 and late 1944 show a consistent pattern. Luftwaffe pilots reported increasing difficulty achieving favorable engagement outcomes against Soviet fighters. The report specifically mentioned American-built aircraft with distinctive profiles and aggressive coordinated tactics. German intelligence officers tried to determine what had changed. They examined crashed P-39s recovered from Soviet territory and found the modifications Soviet mechanics had made: removed wing guns, adjusted control systems, modified radios. But German analysts couldn't understand how these minor changes produced such significant tactical advantages. The real advantage wasn't in the modifications themselves, but in what they represented. Soviet pilots and mechanics working together to optimize aircraft for their specific mission requirements. This kind of field-lay innovation was rare in the rigidly hierarchical Luftwaffe, where modifications required engineering approval from Germany. Soviet units could test changes, evaluate results, and implement improvements within days. German units needed weeks or months for similar processes. German tactical responses evolved throughout late 1943 and 1944. Some pilots tried to avoid engagement with P-39 formations entirely, waiting for opportunities to catch isolated Soviet fighters. This defensive posture contradicted earlier Luftwaffe doctrine and reduced German effectiveness. Other pilots tried more aggressive tactics, closing quickly to negate the Soviets' coordination advantages. But aggression without corresponding performance advantages just meant dying faster. Several experienced Luftwaffe aces were killed in 1944, trying tactics that had worked perfectly in 1942 against less capable Soviet fighters. The psychological impact was significant. For nearly 2 years, the Luftwaffe had dominated Soviet skies. German pilots flew with confidence, knowing their aircraft were superior and their tactics proven. That confidence was eroding. German ace pilots who had scored dozens of victories were being shot down by Soviet pilots and American fighters. The tactics that had worked reliably for 2 years were suddenly failing. The reasons were hard for German intelligence to pinpoint. The aircraft looked the same as the ones Americans flew. The engines were identical. The armament was similar, but Soviet pilots flew them differently, coordinated better, and seemed to always have information advantages. What the Germans couldn't see were the subtle modifications Soviet mechanics made and the tactical innovations Soviet pilots developed. The removed wing guns that improved roll rate, the radio discipline that prevented surprises, the ground radar coordination that positioned Soviet fighters perfectly for ambushes, the stacked altitude formations that gave Soviet pilots multiple chances to engage, the aggressive training that emphasized teamwork over individual glory. All of these factors combined to make the P-39 in Soviet hands a completely different weapon than what Americans or British had fielded. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing fighters to P-39s at rates unseen earlier in the war. Veteran German pilots who had achieved numerous victories against Soviet aircraft were being shot down by Airacco Cobras. On September 21, 1943, Purushkin shot down 3 J-88 bombers in a single pass at low altitude. The engagement was witnessed by many Soviet ground troops and journalists, further spreading his fame. The feat was remarkable not just for the number of kills, but because it demonstrated the P-39's effectiveness against multiple targets in rapid succession. Throughout the autumn of 1943, Soviet P-39 units continued their success. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, equipped entirely with Era Cobras, became one of the most feared Soviet units on the Eastern Front. German pilots learned to identify the distinctive sound of the Allison engine and the appearance of Soviet-era Cobras in formation. Unlike earlier in the war when Soviet fighters operated individually or in loose pairs, P-39 units flew in tight coordinated formations with constant radio communication. The tactical innovations continued to evolve. Soviet pilots developed the pendulum patrol pattern, where fighters would fly in overlapping elliptical paths rather than straight lines. This maintained speed, prevented ambush, and ensured continuous coverage of assigned airspace. The pattern was impossible without reliable radios and well-trained pilots who could maintain formation discipline. Both requirements were met by Soviet P-39 units. The kill ratios tell the story. In 1941, the Luftwaffe destroyed Soviet aircraft at rates of 5-to-1 or higher. By early 1942, the ratio had improved to 3-to-1 in Germany's favor. By late 1943, after P-39s had been in Soviet service for a year, the ratio approached 1-to-1. In some engagements, Soviet P-39 units achieved positive kill ratios, destroying more German aircraft than they lost. This represented a fundamental shift in the air war over the Eastern Front. This wasn't because German pilots had become less skilled. The Luftwaffe was still one of the most professional air forces in the world, but they were facing Soviet pilots in aircraft that finally matched their equipment with radios that allowed coordination, with training that emphasized teamwork and tactics, and with firepower that could destroy German fighters with a single burst. The P-39 gave Soviet pilots the tools they needed. Everything else, the tactics, the aggression, the determination, had always been there. Now they had an aircraft that could execute their plans. American pilots in the Pacific and European theaters never saw this potential. They flew P-39s in environments that exposed every weakness while offering no way to leverage the aircraft's strengths. High-altitude bomber escort required performance the P-39 didn't have. Pacific Island hopping required range the P-39 couldn't provide. Fighting agile Japanese Zeros at altitude meant operating where the P-39 was at its worst. In those contexts, failure was inevitable. The contrast in tactical approaches was stark. American fighter doctrine in the Pacific emphasized individual initiative and aggressive pursuit of targets. Pilots were trained to engage when opportunities appeared and to press attacks until the enemy was destroyed or escaped. This worked well in aircraft like the P-38 or P-47, which had the performance margins to recover from mistakes. In the P-39, operating at the edge of its performance envelope, aggressive individual action often led to disaster. Pilots who chased targets into unfavorable positions found themselves unable to disengage when threatened. Soviet fighter doctrine evolved in the opposite direction during the war. Early Soviet tactics emphasized mass attacks with limited coordination. Individual pilots had little initiative and were expected to follow formation leaders rigidly. This approach failed catastrophically in 1941 and 1942. By 1943, Soviet doctrine had transformed. Pilots were trained to operate in coordinated pairs and flights with constant radio communication. Individual initiative was encouraged within the framework of formation discipline. Pilots could adjust tactics based on immediate situations, while maintaining overall coordination with wingmen and flight leaders. This doctrinal evolution aligned perfectly with the P-39's capabilities. The aircraft's excellent radio made coordination natural and effective. Its performance characteristics rewarded formation discipline rather than individual aggressive pursuit. Its firepower meant coordinated attacks could destroy targets quickly without extended engagements. Soviet pilots adapted their tactics to the aircraft, while American pilots tried to adapt the aircraft to their tactics. One approach succeeded, the other failed. The difference extended to maintenance and technical support. Soviet mechanics working under difficult field conditions prioritized weapon reliability and radio functionality. They removed equipment they considered unnecessary, like wing guns and some armor plating, to improve performance in areas they valued. American mechanics, following technical orders, strictly maintained aircraft to factory specifications, even when those specifications didn't match operational needs. Soviet pilots had direct input into how their aircraft were configured. American pilots had little say in modifications. In the Soviet context, everything aligned perfectly. Medium and low altitude combat, coordinated group tactics enabled by reliable radios, ground support missions requiring sturdy construction and good visibility, interception of German bombers operating at similar altitudes. The P-39 wasn't transformed by Soviet use. It was simply used correctly for the first time. Pushkin ended the war with 59 confirmed victories, 47 scored in P-39s. This made him the second highest scoring Soviet ace and the highest scoring ace flying any American-designed aircraft. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award 3 times on May 24, 1943, August 24, 1943, and August 19, 1944. He also received 4 Orders of Lenin, the Order of the October Revolution, 4 Orders of the Red Banner, 2 Orders of Subaru Second Class, 2 Orders of the Red Star, and the American Distinguished Service Medal. After the war, Pushkin continued serving in the Soviet Air Force, eventually reaching the rank of Marshal of Aviation. He retired in 1981 and died November 13, 1985 at age 72. He never changed his opinion that the P-39 was an excellent fighter when used correctly. Several times during the war, directives from Moscow requested his units consider switching to Soviet-built aircraft, such as the L-5 or Yak fighters. Pushkin turned down these requests each time, preferring to keep his American fighters. Orkolov scored 56 confirmed victories and 6 shared. He flew 452 combat sorties and engaged in 122 dogfights during the war. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award twice on May 24, 1943 and July 1, 1944. After the war, he graduated from the Air Force Academy in 1951, commanded various regiments and air divisions, and became deputy commander of fighter aircraft for the Far Eastern Air Defense Army in 1957. He reached the rank of Major General of Aviation in 1959 before retiring. He wrote 2 books about his experiences. He died December 20, 1990 at age 70. Lieutenant William Fiedler, the only American P-39 ace, is buried in a cemetery in Ohio. His service record notes 5 victories in the P-39 between January and June 1943. No American pilot surpassed that total in the aircraft. The contrast couldn't be starker. One American ace, dozens of Soviet aces. The difference wasn't pilot skill. American pilots were well-trained, aggressive, and capable. The difference was mission requirements and tactical environment. The story of the P-39 is about context. Bell Aircraft built it as a high-altitude interceptor for defending the American coast. When the turbocharger was removed, it became a medium-altitude fighter. Western air forces tried to use it as a high-altitude fighter anyway, and it failed. Soviet air forces tested it as a medium-altitude fighter, and it succeeded spectacularly. The aircraft didn't change. The application changed. On May 9, 1945, Soviet captain Vasily Shinichikov, flying an Arakko Cobra, shot down a German Fowler-Wolf FW-189 reconnaissance aircraft over Prague. This was the last aerial victory of World War II in Europe. Hours later, Germany surrendered. The P-39 that Western air forces had written off scored the final kill of the European war. That same day, a German My-262 jet fighter shot down a P-39 over Bohemia, marking the last Luftwaffe victory of the war. The Arakko Cobra was there at the beginning of Lend-Lease operations to Russia, and there at the very end of the war. Soviet Arakko Cobras continued flying until 1949, when the last operational regiments retired the type and converted to jet fighters. The aircraft served longer in Soviet service than in American or British service and achieved far more success. American military analysts after the war studied Soviet use of P-39s and found the results difficult to accept. Some reports suggested Soviets used different tactics. Others proposed that German fighters on the Eastern Front were inferior to those in the West. German records disproved this. The truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. The P-39 succeeded in Soviet service because it was used correctly. Mission requirements determined success, not inherent aircraft quality. Post-war interviews with Soviet pilots consistently praised the P-39. Rechkov stated in a 1950s interview, "Of course, our fighters quickly caught up with the German Air Force, but aircraft like the P-39Q were well balanced for air combat. The most important advantage, in my opinion, was the high-sensitivity radio. The radio on the Arakko Cobra was able to communicate with flightmates in any situation as if they were talking on the phone next to each other." Other Soviet pilots echoed these sentiments. The radio, more than any other single feature, transformed Soviet fighter operations. The comparison with Soviet domestic fighters was telling. The Yak series fighters were lighter and more agile than P-39s. The LA-5 and L-7 had better climb rates and similar speed, but none matched the P-39's combination of firepower, radio reliability, sturdy construction, and pilot protection. Soviet pilots who flew both types generally preferred the American fighter for these reasons. The few Soviet aces who scored more victories in domestic fighters than P-39s like Ivan Kazadub, with 62 victories primarily in Labs and Lassans, were exceptions that proved the rule about the P-39's effectiveness. Today, the P-39 era Cobra is remembered primarily as a failure in Western aviation history. Museums display them with explanations about rejection by American forces. Aviation enthusiasts know it as the fighter nobody wanted. Books about World War II aircraft often dismiss it in a few paragraphs, focused on its shortcomings. What those accounts rarely convey is the full story. Over 4,000 Soviet pilots flew P-39s in combat. They achieved approximately 3,000 individual victories based on Soviet claims adjusted for known overounting. They developed innovative tactics that changed air warfare on the Eastern Front. They proved that understanding your tools and using them appropriately matters more than having theoretically superior equipment used inappropriately. The lessons extend beyond aviation. Organizations often reject tools or methods that fail in one context, never considering they might excel in another. The assumption that failure in one application means universal failure is common and often wrong. The P-39 failed for Americans and British because they needed something it couldn't provide. It succeeded for Soviets because they needed exactly what it could provide. Both outcomes were predictable based on mission requirements and tactical environments. Soviet pilots who flew P-39s considered them excellent fighters, perfectly suited to their missions. When you've scored 47 victories in an aircraft, when that aircraft's radio coordination saved your life repeatedly, when that aircraft's cannon destroyed enemy fighters with single bursts, you don't see a reject. You see a tool that worked exactly as needed. That was the P-39's reality in Soviet service. A fighter that gave Soviet pilots technological par with the Luftwaffe, heavy firepower, reliable communications, and sturdy construction. These advantages, combined with Soviet tactical innovations and pilot skill, achieved air superiority over the Eastern Front. The story matters because it's about more than one aircraft. It's about the importance of matching capabilities to requirements, about not dismissing tools that failed in one context without considering other contexts, about understanding that different tactical environments demand different solutions. The P-39 taught these lessons. American and British forces learned them through frustration and failure. Soviet forces learned them through testing and success. The aircraft remained constant. The difference was everything around it. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories